for a variety of reasons, a lot of the traditions are losing their significance for large groups of people. And what do we do then? Because we still have this need to have this mystery that I am, that you are, contained in something. And so Jung speaks to this and says, we are in the process of finding ways to enable a human person to sustain a connection to the meaning of their lives, but in a very different way than, let's say, a religious tradition.
Ken, it's good to see you again. We recorded a podcast, I think just a few weeks ago, and there is so much kind of left over from that conversation that I still wanted to talk with you about, that we thought it'd be a good idea to do another one. And just want to thank you for your generosity in coming back.
Thank you for asking me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, I think we got into like a lot of Jungian theory and things like that in the first one, and there was so much I wanted to talk with you about like kind of practices,
Hmm.
and particularly because you started a center in Chicago called the Soulwork Center, and Soulwork is a name or term that I kind of landed on to be like an umbrella for all the different things that I do. And so maybe a good place to start is if you could tell us like what you mean by soul work.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And both parts of that, I think, have a deep significance for me. One is soul, and Jung is one of the few psychologists who speak seriously about the soul. And if you read the Red Book or the Black Books, he chronicles dialogues with his soul. That concept usually is reserved for the religious sphere, but Jung brought it into deeply into the psychological reality of the human person. The work part of it stems both from Jung and also from my work with the Gurdjieff teachings, Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, because most of the time we approach the concept of soul either I have a soul or there's no such thing as a soul. It's a ridiculous religious concept. And both Jung and Gurdjieff, but especially Jung in this context, reminds us that we have to work to build our soul, to sustain our soul, to feed our soul. And we can't take it for granted. And if we're too outward oriented, if we're too focused on adaptation to the outer world, we can lose touch with what Jung calls soul.
Hmm.
So the idea of soul is important, but also the idea of work. And it's a work that is never done. It's a work that we have to keep returning to, but not in a ritualized or a routine way. But we have to find new ways to cultivate our connection to soul.
Hmm. Okay, well, this kind of opens up the question like what is soul? How do you conceive of soul? Do you think about it metaphysically or metaphorically?
Can I cop out and say yes? Uh,
Both? Yes, and?
Metaphorically, uh, since most of the things that we talk about are themselves metaphors, I think, for a much deeper reality, I think we could say it's metaphoric. Metaphysically, in terms of reflecting on our physicality and what makes us beings, perhaps there too. Um, Conceiving of soul within Jung's teachings, I think, is very much connected to an amplification of Jung that Edward Edinger developed in his book, Ego and Archetype. Edinger coined the term the ego self axis, which indicates that connection from the ego complex to the deeper part of our personhood called the self by Jung. And soul work from that perspective is reminding ourselves that we have to work to sustain our awareness of that ego self axis, that axis that is always sending material for the ego to work on, and that is ready to receive material from the ego to amplify that deeper part of not only our being, but all being, of all sentient beings across all space and throughout all time. It would correspond to what Helena Blavatsky would call beingness. She doesn't speak about the self in the same way, but it's that core. And the ego doesn't initiate it, but the ego needs to work to sustain it. It's, holding that tension between the so-called outer world and this core of our being, really, is the work that the ego has to continue to perform throughout our lives. So I take it as a reality, but it's a very evanescent or ephemeral reality. It isn't real like my nose is real.
Mm-hmm.
It's real in a much deeper way.
Mm-hmm.
My nose can be altered, but that can't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I always found it curious that that Jung and Edinger um, didn't talk more directly about soul, using terms like self and psyche. I don't know. I find that kind of curious. Like, are we not talking about then, or could we not say that it's something like the ego soul axis for the conscious ego to stay in connection with this deepest, innermost part of oneself as the soul? Is self and soul, are they the same?
No, no. The self is much bigger. Soul is, my soul is particularly related to me, to this little limited ego complex. The self is much, much bigger. Uh, if you think of the self as a sphere, which has an infinite number of points on its surface, and each person that ever was, is, or will be is one of those points on the surface of the sphere. And you could think of the ego complex as emerging from it, having its experience in space and time. And then at the end of that, perhaps returning to it, we're not clear. Um, Jung talks about this in many ways in Seven Sermons to the Dead, also in the Red Book and the Black Books. But I wouldn't equate soul and self. The tendency to want to collapse those categories is quite understandable. And I think from the ego's perspective could give us a sense of uh, maybe more authority vis-a-vis the self than we really ought to assume we have. Jung did a kind of as he did in so many ways, being in the 21st century, we see this even more clearly. He did a kind of a gender um, sort of play with soul and spirit. And Jung said that spirit is the masculine principle and soul is the feminine principle. I think we can set aside those kinds of gender distinctions. But what we could say is that soul is deeply connected with my embodiment. So that in this form, in this carbon-based form, soul somehow animates me. And in fact, one of the meanings of the word anima is soul, which may be why Jung considered soul to be feminine. But I don't want to get too caught up in that, because
Mm-hmm.
we could do a lot of apologetics on Jung's genderizing of a lot of things. I don't know that it's useful, but I would think of soul as a companion to me as I make my way through time in this form.
Hmm.
but the self is much bigger. I don't even like using terms like that. Uh, you could substitute God or divinity for the self,
Hmm. Yeah.
and then you see it's mapless, right? But each one of us has a little aperture into it, a little connection to it that enlivens us and companions us.
Hmm. Yeah. One of the ways that I think of soul, and again, yeah, it's a thing that it's a concept that is so hard to define and kind of resists definition, to pin it down to, uh, but as a kind of soul as a connector, as the
Yeah,
intermediary, the interface between the greater, world soul or great spirit or God.
yep. That, yeah, that fits
Mm.
definitely, right? And
And
all,
well, and just to say, like, along with that, there is that, I think that the personal element of soul, that it is specific to this incarnation. And I believe in reincarnation. There seems to be things that come in with our birth, from, whether we think of that as genetics or our ancestry or whatever, but we seem to come in with particular qualities and characteristics and even maybe a destiny. Um, so there is that personal aspect, and so the great spirit can get filtered through that personal soul in a way that we have our own unique individual relationship with the great self or the great spirit. Y- Yeah,
yeah,
would you agree with that as a
I
good way to
would.
think of it?
I would. And as far as destiny or fate is concerned, that's very much a part of Jung's understanding of the human person. Because, and this was one of the big sort of breakthroughs that Jung brought to an understanding of the life stream that we're in. Clearly, we are the result to a certain extent of causes and conditions that have arisen during my time here on the planet in this form. Jung never denied that. But Jung also said that there was a telos, a fate, a future to which we're being pulled, which is kind of what you're alluding to. And this is another aspect of Jung's psychology that makes us uncomfortable in the kind of two-dimensional world of, 20th and 21st century psychology,
Hmm.
because it, in a sense, limits my absolute freedom. Because, as you said, I do have a destiny. Things do cross my path that I can't see as a result of causation in space and time in my past. We
Hmm.
can use the metaphor of reincarnation or past life. And when I say metaphor, I don't mean anything disrespectful, because all of these ways to understand the limits of human experience are going to be metaphoric. So we can use that because, yes, it does feel like I was meant to be doing something. I was meant to meet this person. I was meant to have this relationship. I'm meant to, if it isn't such a good thing, you'd say I was doomed to meet this person or I was doomed to have it. But either way,
Hmm.
we're talking about um, that idea that there's something pulling us towards something over which we have very limited control in a kind of a not too polite way of putting it. And you could always bleep this out. I always say when the self calls you, it isn't that we don't have freedom, but our freedom becomes limited to going face forward or ass backwards. But
Hmm.
we have to
Being,
go.
yeah, right. Being dragged unwillingly.
Right, right.
Yeah. Hmm.
And all of Jung's work is to bring as much consciousness as we can to the present moment so that we can at least be fully present to what is unfolding.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, it seems to me that that in itself is a kind of therapeutic idea, in that it helps us to broaden our perspective on our personal biography, on the ups and downs of our life, the challenges that we face. If we can embrace that idea, or at least allow it in for consideration, I don't know, it opens us in a way that I think is therapeutic and relieves some of the suffering.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I like that use of the word that the idea itself is therapeutic. It does bring healing,
Mm,
even in the midst of uncomfortable situations.
hmm. Yeah, especially
Yeah,
in the midst of uncomfortable situations. That's something like, I think about this quite often. Like, what is the cause of so much of our suffering in the modern world? And I think it's some of it has to do with us losing that larger context for our lives in a kind of post-religious world, where so many of us find it impossible to believe in the religious traditions of our ancestry. Um, and so we can be kind of left in this like groundless liminal space, without any way to look at our lives from that larger perspective or that sense of fate or the soul having its own telos. And so I think that's one of the things that depth psychology, that Jung's work can restore in us in a kind of secular way. Would you see that as part of the role or the possible function of psychology in modern life?
absolutely. And Jung wrote about this in several places. He has a whole book of essays called Modern Man in Search of a Soul. And there's an essay, it's either in that book or in another book, Psychotherapists or the Clergy, where
Mm,
he says very much what you just said, that as the religious traditions that for centuries, probably millennia, have been able to contain the struggle that humanity has had for a deeper meaning to what's going on, as they have become weakened for a variety of reasons, maybe by design, the design of the self. Um, Maybe we needed those. It's kind of like when I was younger, I had braces on my teeth. Some people do. I don't have them now. You have them until your teeth reach a point where you don't need them anymore. And maybe that's the function that these traditions have had for humanity over the centuries. But for a variety of reasons, a lot of the traditions are losing their significance for large groups of people. And what do we do then? Because we still have this need to have this mystery that I am, that you are, contained in something. And we see in philosophy the rise of the existential movement or the absurdist movement, and even deconstructionism. This is a struggle for what really is going on here. Is it only this tiny little existence that has meaning? In which case, that meaning is absurd. And
mm,
so Jung speaks to this and says, we we are in the process of finding ways to enable a human person to sustain a connection to the meaning of their lives, but in a very different way than, let's say, a religious tradition might dictate. We kind of have to work with the self to understand it. This is what Jung um, addresses in large part in his essay Answer to Job.
mm.
And it, in fact, is what the biblical book of Job is struggling with as well. If you look
Mm.
at it historically and critically, uh, from the
Well, I
perspective of when it rose up in the texts. Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I, I mean that was such a kind of blasphemous, heretical writing by Jung to suggest that God himself needed to evolve, for God's consciousness
Yeah.
to Job being one of the instruments of that transformation or that growth. It's a wild idea, but I don't know. If you look at the self, I don't know. It's so hard to grasp because it's so big, the idea of God, and then the self, as something like, if it is God, how could it evolve? Would it not already be like everything, the wholeness? And how can wholeness evolve? So I find that hard to grasp with.
Well, to say something evolves requires that there be the dimension of time. And if we look at the position of the divine, whatever you want to call it, the self, God, Great Spirit, um, there, if everything is there, whatever that means, because words like theirs are also space as a function,
Mhm.
then there is no time either. So time is a function of human consciousness. And could it be, and I'm riffing here, could it be that the self had to express that dimension through humanity, maybe through all sentient beings, uh, as a means of amplifying the totality that it be?
Mm, mm.
I don't know. This is something that intrigues me.
Yeah, me too. But what's just coming to mind now is that perhaps it's talking more about our conception of God evolving, not God
Right,
itself.
right, right,
Yeah.
right. But then if our conception of God evolves to one end, and
Well, to the Nietzschean end, perhaps,
ah,
like where we no longer need that personalized conception of God, right? Isn't that what Nietzsche meant by saying God is proclaiming
among
God is
other,
dead?
yeah, 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 yeah. And the whole idea that you were mentioned, I was just thinking about Jung's Zarathustra lectures. Jung, um, well, it ends up being 2 volumes. It was many, many years where he lectured on Nietzsche's Thus Spake Zarathustra. Um, so very definitely that could be. I guess I resist having any particular exemplification of it. Um, it may well be that Nietzsche was getting a glimpse of it, but I think there were other glimpses too. And I, I struggle with this myself because the ego, this ego, would love to have um, a complete theory of everything.
Mm, yeah.
That was what, my early studies were in mathematics. My first degree was in mathematics. Um, but then, you pull your hair up because in mathematics, there have been proven that there are incompletenesses in
Mm,
mathematics. So the attempt of the human mind, even in something as abstract and content free as mathematics, fails to be consistent within itself. Because I think what we're talking about is a greater mystery than any particular philosopher, scientist, mathematician, artist can fully encapsulate. And this to me is the idolatry we have to fight, even the idolatry that I would be more prone to embrace of Jung and
right.
analytical psychology. I have to
Yeah.
fight that all the time.
Hey, I want to take a moment to speak with you about this channel. Currently, only 11% of viewers are subscribed to the channel. I think those numbers are terrible. So if you're enjoying this content and you want to help out the channel, please take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. And if you really want to help out the channel, you can become a member of the Howl in the Wilderness Patreon, which will give you access to early release of full ad-free episodes, plus access to the archive of the first 100 episodes of this podcast. It would really help me out and allow me to keep creating content like the interview that you're watching right now. Okay, thanks so much. Now, back to the interview. Right. And when you say idolatry of like Jungian ideas or Jungianism, I think about those nice clean diagrams of the self and the ego and the archetypes, and it's like, oh, there it is, all in like a nice little mandala, and that explains everything.
Everything. Right. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. I often lament that, gosh, really, like, part of me really wishes that I could just believe in the Christianity that, I grew up in and was baptized in. Um, but what I guess the wrestling part is like I feel like I just know too much, like I've explored all of these other uh ways of thinking about the world, of spirituality, and I see all of them as valid expressions of, our relationship to this great mystery. And so for me to like believe in one that answers everything excludes so much else. And I think that's one of the challenges that faces us in this age of information and the free flow of information and, comparative religion and all of the work that Joseph Campbell and others did. Um, it's like we kind of just know too much, and to raise one as the truth discounts everyone else's story and life way.
Well, and there's where the power complex gets involved, right? Because, and we see this in the evolution of religious thought. We see this in the evolution of um, even academic thought. There will be a right way. There will be an orthodoxy, and that's a power trip. And I joke, and I'm very grateful for the experiences I had in higher education, and I myself was a practitioner for 40 years. But I really came to understand through my work, my own analysis, and then as an analyst, that basically education teaches us to ignore data rather than embrace data. Because we learn that there's a paradigm that will explain everything, and that which will not be explained by the paradigm, we are taught isn't important, doesn't exist. And if you persist in examining it, you will get in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And that's no different than the Spanish Inquisition.
Mm-hmm.
If you come up with a heretical idea, I mean, in academia, you're not burned at the stake, but
Mm.
being denied
Yeah.
tenure is kind of a way that people are burned at the stake,
Mm.
which makes me
Yeah.
wonder, because I had tenure, what did I have to give up to do that? And
Mm.
maybe that's what the third of my life is about, is atoning for those sins and trying to figure it all out before it's over.
Yeah. Well, to achieve kind of security and success in any organization or system, you have to kind of play within the guidelines of the game in a way, right? And so you have to like leave a lot of things out or keep some things out. Yeah. What gets left out? I mean, that's such an important question. I think that's kind of a Jungian question, like what is being left out here, rather than just looking at the material that that's presented. Also, just as important to see what's being left out.
Well, therein lies the shadow.
Mm, mm,
The shadow is what we want to leave out in order to tailor a persona that suits us.
mm,
And so when we're confronted by the other, which really is just an entity that we ourselves have othered, people talk about doing shadow work. I don't know that anybody really wants to, because what it means is opening up to everything that has been left out, everything on the other side of the margins that we ourselves create and indicate this is what we need to be looking at. And we all do it. Everybody
mm.
does.
Not me.
Not you. Well, no. Right. That's why I'm so grateful to talk to you, because you can touch the hem of your garment and heal all my ill. But yeah, and I could say the same thing, maybe just the two of us.
Right.
But
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
but you look at how hard it is to really accept how much we don't know, when all our lives we're given accolades for knowing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And but moving into that mystery, I think this is again, um, Jung shows us with his non-canonical writings, the red book, the black books, some of his lectures. If you read some of the transcripts of his lectures, you see how all over the place his thought could be. And, I don't think Jung was afraid to move into the dark places because I don't think he had a choice.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And the dark places being also like the places of unknowing, right?
Mm.
Like, so there's something here, like, I think there's a thread here, whether we're talking about religious orthodoxy or these like established systems or our own kind of ego structure. Uh, there is something like it all kind of acts as a defense against the anxiety provoked by mystery, by
Yeah.
unknowing, by the hugeness and vastness, the unknowability
Mm.
of reality, ourselves, of the world. So when, you know, now when the world is kind of in so much turmoil and chaos, I see a lot of people who are converting to Orthodox Christianity. And I
Mhm.
can't help but judge that in a way as a kind of a regression, as an inability to hold the tension caused by turmoil, by uncertainty, by all the kind of fear that that provokes. It just seems to me like a backwards move. I don't know. Like, do you have any thoughts about that? Because you've probably seen it too, right?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Um, and I know that within the tradition I was raised in, which was Roman Catholicism, um, many of the religious communities are dying out. The ones that seem to be getting new members are the more what I would call restrictive uh, kinds of orders. The more enclosed orders, the more traditional garb and everything. And I think of it as sad. I understand the desire to do
Mm,
that. And as you said earlier, I would love for there to be within me a reawakening of an adherence to an orthodoxy. But it just isn't anything that's happening here. It isn't in me to do that. Um, and I don't know what it means psychologically. There were several times in my own life when I thought about joining a religious community, especially a monastic community.
mm, mm,
And after I got my doctorate and I was already teaching before I was in analysis, I actually went to the Catholic Theological Union here in Chicago to study as a lay student because I wanted to know. I wanted to know what this was about. And as part of that, I would go to uh, a Trappist monastery in Iowa for retreats, and I really enjoyed it. And there was a woman that I worked with at CTU, Catholic Theological Union, who was a nun. She was a Old Testament scholar, very wonderful woman. She's still living. Um, and I went to her once and I said, I think I'm really called to join an enclosed monastic community. And she sat there for a while and she said, I can't help but feel that if you were there, you would be talking to someone like me, telling them that you thought you really were called to be in the world.
mm,
And that just broke it open for me. It was nothing dramatic, but in that remark, she showed me that how can you know that? That may seem okay to you now, but you seem to be thriving out here.
mm,
So what does that say? Don't give that up and do a 180 flip. And I'm very grateful for that counsel. I don't think I would have lasted very long, even if I did, but
mm,
if I had gone in. But there is that longing. And for me, the value of all of those religious traditions, all of them, is that they sustain the symbol systems that represent millennia of effort on the part of the human community to understand all of this.
Mhm.
And if you look at it that way, okay, I can see value. But I just don't feel at this point that I could honestly say I'm an orthodox adherent of anything. And I've tried a lot,
Mhm.
it's Buddhist, and Buddhism is extremely important to me. Um, but it doesn't contain all of reality. It doesn't answer everything. In particular, the idea of a soul that persists after death.
Right. I wanted to ask you about that because I saw that, I think you were even ordained in the Zen tradition,
Like,
weren't you? Yeah.
yeah,
So I was going to
right.
ask you if you saw any conflict between the Buddhist idea of the no self and, our Jungian embrace of the soul and
Kinda. Yeah, right. Right. And I was an analyst at the time that I took that lay ordination, and I worked with a very kind and wise man who, again, he's now dead. He ran the Zen Buddhist temple of Chicago here. His name was Richard Langlois, Congo Langlois Roshi. He was a Roshi. He was a Westerner. And prior to becoming a Zen priest, he was a musician. He was very much in the world. And he began studying Zen and became a priest, but he was very kind, very wise. And we would talk about this, and he would value what I had to say about the soul and about the self, and was very interested in it. And I gained a lot and still do from understanding the world from that perspective as well. Because the Zen teaching, well, Buddhist teaching, that everything is made up of a combination of five aggregates: form, I have to say the parts to remember them all: form, feeling, thought, impulse, and consciousness. It's translated differently uh, uh, in different settings. But that we construct reality from a combination of these aggregates. So as such, everything that we say exists is only exists dependently on every other thing that exists. That's the Buddhist teaching of dependent origination. It isn't that nothing exists. Sometimes people think that Buddhists teach that nothing exists. No, things exist, but they don't exist in isolation.
Mhm.
And if one thing goes, everything goes. So nothing goes. It's sort of like that. Jung wrote about Western and Eastern, in his terminology, approaches to spirituality. Psychology and Religion, West and East, is the name of one of his collected works. And, it is true that a Western attitude and an Eastern attitude are, in some sense, incompatible, especially if you get to the ultra Buddhist idea of total dependent origination. But all of the traditions meet in terms of their affirmation of the presence of suffering
Mhm.
and the desire to be released from suffering. Now, there's where they begin to differ, because the release is going to depend to a large extent on the anthropology and the cosmology of the tradition. But, in the words of the Dalai Lama, all sentient beings seek to be happy and avoid suffering. We all have that in common.
Mhm.
So even someone that I might consider to be doing reprehensible acts is actually on the same quest as I am. And that makes me very uncomfortable
Mhm.
when I even just saying it, because it means you have to withhold a lot of judgment,
Mhm.
which I find very difficult, frankly.
Yeah, well, it would require a great amount of deconditioning ourselves of like the moral frameworks that get programmed into us by our culture and family and all of that, right? And to get down to the essence of being. And that's an incredibly expansive point of view. Hard to sustain. Maybe we have glimpses of it and we feel the relief of it and it acts as a touchstone, right?
Hmm?
Um, there's something about like, one of the reasons I'm a yoga practitioner is because it gives me a practice to address the problems of suffering, particularly uh, suffering that can be avoided. And I kind of put suffering in two categories. There's the unavoidable suffering of life, that fate visits upon us, sickness, death, and all of that. And then there's a whole nother category of suffering that we kind of create for ourselves by, distortions of thinking and perception. And so yoga helps me to unravel at least that part. And so if I can at least kind of take care of that on a daily, ongoing basis, then
Mm.
my burden of suffering is lessened. And I really appreciate that about the yoga tradition.
Yes.
Is something about Zen, is that how what it serves for you in terms of just kind of like clearing the mind of what.
Certainly clearing the mind. And um, sort of when you sit returning just to this, there's a Zen writing, and the author is escaping me right now, an ancient Japanese author, but the title translates just this is it. And you get, as you said, you can get glimpses. If you sit long enough, yeah, this really is it. All it is all it is. But then as soon as you put it into words, then it becomes a little motto or a little mantra, and it becomes empty.
Yeah, it becomes a placeholder for the actual experience, right?
Right,
And so
right,
you can repeat the mantra all you want, but if you're not having the experience, it's meaningless.
right, right.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, well, there's something about that, like even there, like returning to that thisness, the what Blavatsky called beingness,
Venus, yeah.
the beingness, which is not even like beingness. It's just beingness, so it's less like about something happening and unraveling. It's so like
Right.
pointed.
Yeah.
Beingness. I like that. But when you return to that point, like it may be a fraction of a second or something, but in that space, it's so infinite and expansive that it feels like such a relief. I think of it sometimes like I do my yoga practice, take a vacation from all of the, thinking about the past, thinking about the future, worrying about the rent, and oh my God, how am I? And it's just like, it's like a dip in a nice pool or something. I think it's helpful to like take a dip every day, at least once a day.
Right, right.
Yeah. Well, that comes around to like practice, like soul work as a practice. So, aside from, going to do your analysis, bringing your dreams to analysis and that kind of thing, you've had all these other interests. And, I wonder if you see all those different practices, whether it's the tarot, your Zen practice. Um, I would even say, like, isn't what we've been doing, like, kind of talking about life and philosophy and wrestling with the big questions? I
Mm.
would consider that a kind of soul work too, because
Absolutely.
it's it's like coming from my soul and my mind, is tries to put language to it all, but
Mm.
it's coming from a deeper place, a yearning for something. So let's talk about that a bit. Like just like what people can do in order to help stay in contact with their soul and listen to its provocations and urgings.
Yeah. So here's where the struggle with the ego can really be felt
Hmm.
because all of the things that we've been talking about, whether it's writing your dreams down, uh, sitting in meditation, practicing yoga, um, yeah, we could think of any other things. None of these things make any sense in terms of the way the world wants us to believe things make sense. And by that very fact, they are valuable because there is no purpose to writing your dreams down. There's no purpose to meditation. There's no purpose to any of these things. They are what they are. Now, we can take the images from a dream, reflect on them, and deepen our understanding of what's going on in our lives in space and time. That has value. But the dream itself is pure non-rational presence from, as I understand it, the unconscious. When I sit in meditation, sometimes people that come to see me will ask, do you think meditation would be useful? I never push it, never push any of these practices, but I also don't hide the fact that I do them. And I'll say, yeah, meditation would help. Well, I have a hard time meditating because I can't clear my mind. And I always say, well, stand in line behind me, because the purpose of meditation is to show you how unruly the mind is. And what we try to do when we sit is let it all play until we get bored enough that we actually ignore it. And maybe for 2 seconds, experience the absolute profound silence that's underneath it all. And that's very daunting to the ego, because you read a lot about, there was a pretty critical article of mindfulness practice as it's being marketed. It was an article that I think was called McMindfulness. And a lot of people were very angry about it. But if I meditate to get something, I just might as well, do some more investing in the stock market, because that's actually, ironically, more sure than meditating to get something. And similarly, if I use if I write down my dreams to get somewhere, that's a waste of time. Because when we go to the dream, when we go in meditation, when we go to the tarot or any divination practice, when we go to a sweat lodge, we leave behind all of our intentions and open ourselves up to these non-rational means of experiencing our human state. And that does help. And I'm not saying that you can't learn from your dreams, or that you can't get great insight from meditating, or from doing a sweat lodge, or from a tarot reading. But it's not the same as the payoff I would get if I, work out every day and cut back on my eating by 500 calories a day. I'll get real chartable results by doing that. And that's good in its own domain. But this is something different. And it's opening us up to a dimension of human experience that I think we have been socialized to believe doesn't exist or doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, I would say that, this soul work, it is measurable, but in a very different way. Like, I think of it more like measurable in terms of a kind of a deep satisfaction or richness that I'm adding to my life. Like when, earlier you said like we need to kind of grow our soul or build our soul up. James Hillman, took Keats's term soul making, which I like, but I prefer the more of a kind of a gardening metaphor in terms of the kind of care and feeding of the soul so that it can grow and fill us out, and our life then becomes more soulful. And I guess I can measure that in terms of how I'm able to not get totally thrown by the chaos in the world. There's like a deeper, more weighty center to
Mhm.
me in my life. And there's a feeling of like connection that I relate to the soul. Like if I can go outside and just like smell the air and look at the world around me and appreciate it, that to me is like coming from my soul. And if I'm out of touch with that, I'm losing that connection in a way, or that appreciation. So there are these other like very less tangible ways, like so like subjective and personal ways that I feel like I can measure the kind of impact of the soul work that I've done. You know?
Yeah. You remind me, maybe I was a year into my first analysis, and I went in to see my analyst, and I said, I don't think this is working. I was thinking of leaving. And he said to me, well, what do you mean? I said, I'm not any happier. And very calmly, he just said, well, who said anything about happy?
Hmm.
This isn't about happy. It's about being aware. It's about consciousness. I guess I was expecting he'd defend it and say, well,
Hmm.
you are happier. Look at how blah, 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 blah. And that was an important lesson for me because I was unaware that the metric I had in my mind was happier. I want to be happier. I don't know what that would lead to, like happy all the time. Um,
Smiling like an idiot all the time.
right, all the time. I just don't know. But that was important to
Mm,
just a very gentle, and that I think
yeah,
moved me uh, in what I want to judge as the right direction.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's something about this, and like, one of the reasons why like I was interested to talk to you, and then like to come back and talk to you again, like looking at the library behind you, you obviously like we share a lot of eclectic interests in strange and esoteric things, um, and like all of that complicates my life in a way. Like going back to like, wouldn't it be nice if I could just believe in like one
Yes.
theory of everything, one belief system? Oh, where I can just have an answer for everything that comes up. But all the stuff that I just cannot help but be interested in complicates things for me. It complicates things, but it also makes my life, I feel, richer and more interesting, not easier.
No, no. And well, you're not seeing the books that are on that wall.
Yeah, right.
Are the books that I don't no, I mean, there's no design, believe me, to the way I shelve my books. But you're right. I think for me, all of these are part of a search to understand this. And all of these books, all of the things that I do and that I've done grow out of that desire. And you're right, they complicate things because I've gotten to the point where I know the next book is not going to answer everything.
Hmm.
And it may even open me up to more questions. But that I think
If it's a good one, it
is
might,
a good
right?
one, right?
Yeah.
That I think is very important. I'm just looking at a book by Baudrillard, Simulacra and Simulation, which was the book that formed the basis for the Matrix movies.
Mm.
And I read it years ago, and I'll go back to it and I'll read it and I'll see something subtle that I didn't see before. Jung, I mean, I don't even have to go to that. Jung, because I continue to teach, and colleagues and I will work together to put courses together. And we just sit, and it's like we've read these books. They're all marked up with yellow and pen and everything else. I never saw that before.
Hmm.
I never, I never read that in that way. And this is a common occurrence among people, even people who at one point were my teachers and now we're colleagues. And that to me is exciting because it means the books haven't changed. The words are the same, right? I've changed.
Hmm.
I'm now given to notice something that just flew by 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 30 years ago. And as you said, that's a very subtle signal that there has been development. There has been something that I've attained.
Hmm.
But it's, how do you say that? How do you get a feel for that?
Yeah. Where do you mark it on a 1 to 5 rating scale?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, I'm deeper now than I was 5 years ago. Just wait. If I live 5 years longer, I'll be even deeper. Until in about 25 years, I'll be really deep, right? 6 feet under.
Yeah.
Uh,
Who was it, Heraclitus, that said this? There, we can never know the depths of the soul, right?
you can never put your foot in the same river twice.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, that's something like, that's something that Hillman highlighted for me, drawing out that quote, the depths of the soul are unknowable. Um, And so there's no end to the knowing, which would satisfy the ego to be able to say, oh, yes, this is what the soul is, where it resides in the body, where it goes after it dies, and how it comes into birth and all. Oh, isn't that nice, right? Um, yeah, there are stories that kind of wrap that up in a nice little bow for us, but then there are all these other stories. And so there's something about that, like, fathomless depth of the soul that is wide open, but like you said, it also leaves open more learning, more kind of insight, more revelation, more curiosity, which I think curiosity is one of the things that pulls us into life,
Yes.
right?
Yep. Yep. Yeah. That's why, been there, done that is a very sad mantra.
Mm-hmm. Check it off the list, never have
Right.
to revisit it.
Like the bucket list notion,
Mhm.
there's a hole in my bucket. That thing will never be filled. And
It's
that's
good.
just how I want it,
Hmm.
because can you imagine if you ever got to the end of that list?
Mm.
What then?
Yeah. Yeah, like at the end of life, if you just felt like, well, I feel like I did everything I was here to do, I can't imagine me ever saying that.
Good. Yeah. Because then you'll be alive till you aren't.
Yeah.
You know, to reawaken a sense of being alive, you probably see this too. So many people are struggling with what has been labeled depression. And
Hmm.
it's a real thing. It's a definite real thing. But often when you probe, it's a sense of a lack of any kind of meaning, a lack of any kind of hope that there can ever be any meaning. It's like all of the answers are in and they're all unsatisfactory. And I don't know where to turn. And I think in addition to whatever other therapeutic interventions a depressed person can access, like in some cases medication or cognitive behavioral approaches, I think awakening them to the mystery of human life can go a long way to easing that sense of ennui that accompanies depression. Why should
Hmm.
I try? Why should I take that course or go to that meetup or whatever? It's all just going to be empty anyway. Well, what if it isn't?
Hmm.
Can you just say, what if it isn't? And I wonder if we're not looking at a soul sickness,
Hmm.
and the anxiety is the other one. I never know where the next thing's going to come from that's going to throw me off. Yeah, neither do I. That's why you have to really work at being as present as you can to what's going on, because we don't ever know.
Hmm. Isn't there something that helps us with both, I would say on both ends of the spectrum, depression and anxiety, uh, something about having well, like what Jung called a personal myth or a life story, let's say, like a story that somewhat answers like, why am I here? Or why are we here? What's this all for? Uh, doesn't that act as a kind of ballast?
It can, as long as it doesn't become something that I then have to fulfill. As long
Say more.
as, well, as long as it doesn't become the myth of me. So then I begin to organize my life to support the myth of me, because me is not done. And so I'm constantly constructing the myth of me. I'm living the myth of me. And it's sort of like when we have a motif, a mythic motif, like the hero's journey or the whatever, if that becomes a monomyth, and then we begin to see everything I do as heroic, or everything I do as altruistic, or everything I do as whatever, you're missing the point on that one. There are
Mm.
times in my life when I've been heroic. There's times in my life when I've been incredibly selfish and completely uncaring about the other. I'm not proud of either of those, and I'm not particularly responsible for either of those. They happened in the Ken project. And I think to hold that lightly is important, because
Mhm.
if we close off an understanding of myself by claiming this is my myth, this was why I was born, sooner or later that's going to fail.
Mm. I mean, I'm turning 50 this year, and only been really wrestling with this stuff like in a deeper way since my, midlife crisis, my middle age.
Yeah, yeah,
Well, who knows where the middle is actually? That's why I was stumbling with that because, like, I don't know.
I know.
I may be at the middle now, or I may have been at the middle when I was, 25. Um, but like, kind of the myth that I've been living with lately, and maybe so that's part of it, right? Is like the myth is provisional, like something to revisit, like to
Hmm.
kind of revisit our sense of a personal myth. But what I've been living with now is it's kind of like non-heroic in a way that like our role as humans here on Earth is to appreciate creation and to somehow contribute to it, which isn't very heroic. And it's like, but I don't know, that's just where I've been kind of like,
But
that's my
beautiful.
landing spot these days.
Right, right. And maybe to get to a place where you can embrace that as your current myth required a lot of heroism.
Hmm.
That may have been part of the biography, that may have been part of the story.
Hmm. Well, maybe heroic in the sense that I had to like confront a lot of demons and dragons and things like that, heroic inflations, maybe even confronting that is a form of like uh, counter heroism or something.
Yeah. But I think that, bringing beauty, I'm 72. I will be 73 in a couple of months. And, at this point in my life, sometimes I'll just pause and go, huh, who would have thought? And I can go back to, that's one of the values of my practice, because I see people at all stages of life.
Mm,
And you have to be present to that life space while also maintaining where you are. I remember what it was like to be 25. So when I see someone who's 25 who's struggling, I I feel compassion.
hmm.
Maybe for them, I think they would experience it as for them, but I think it's beginning to have compassion for myself and the bumbling idiot that
Hmm.
I was, who thought what hot stuff I was
Hmm.
at 25 or 50 and or 60 or. Um, and I've also worked with people much older than me. And the beauty in that too, of understanding what do you do when you have to make incredible compromises on what you're able to engage with.
Mm. Hmm.
Someone who's 87 is not going to be engaging the way someone who's 50 is. And
Right.
watching how they make peace with it. This is something I fight, watching how I have to make peace with the limitations that are just part of being in this body at this age. Uh, yeah, it's just,
Hmm.
it can be incredibly beautiful and, also incredibly touching in a very deep way
Hmm.
because we're really all here. That's so important.
Yeah. Yeah, and like, I mean, so the work that we do, like sitting with people, listening to their stories, talking with them about, these big life questions, and opening up a space where we can value dreams and imagination, and you know, that to me is kind of a soul work. Like my soul gets so much from working with people in this way. And I think part of the reason why I started to work with people is because I just needed that in my life. And I found it so hard to get in kind of the regular world. Because I think like people like us, people like our clients, are maybe the minority, and maybe even quite rare.
Maybe,
People afflicted with this this yearning to like explore and delve deeply into life's questions.
right. I
Hmm.
always say that don't go into analysis unless you really have no other choice. That's really important. It's kind
Yeah.
of, I should have above my office door, abandon hope, ye who enter here. Because if the other things worked, I don't think this is where I would be.
Yeah. Well, and there's something like about it too, like what you're saying or what we've been talking about is it will do away with all of those structures, right? And like really kind of open things out, like lay them flat, question all the beliefs and everything, right? That's part of analysis, isn't it?
It is. It
Hmm.
is. When I was 16, um, I may have said this the last time we talked. I got the Carole King album,
Hmm.
a Carole King album. I think it was her second album. And I brought it.
Tapestry?
It may have been Tapestry. It may have been a second album. I can't
Hmm.
remember now. I could see the cover. But I remember I was 16, came home, ripped it open. It was my parents' stereo because it was, one of those big like altars.
Yeah.
I put it on, and there was a song that was called Song of Long Ago. And I remember listening to it. And this is for me genius because Carole King was maybe in her 20s at the time. But there was a line in the song, and I remember at 16 listening to this, and the line was, "If it had been as I intended, I wouldn't have the peace I know, loving the people I've befriended, and singing a song of long ago." And I remember as a kid listening to that, thinking, that's important.
Hmm.
I don't know why it's important, but that's important. And now I see, if it had been as the ego intended,
Hmm.
oh boy, my life would look very different. If my ego were in charge, holy hell. But there's just such wisdom we have to have an intention. We have to go forward,
Yeah.
dire, right? Life would
Yeah.
be far too frightening if you didn't. And then life happens.
Hmm.
And then working with that can bring a sense of peace,
Hmm.
but it
Yeah.
isn't maybe not what we imagined.
Yeah. Yeah. I like the word from the yoga tradition, santosha, which means not happiness, but contentment. There's something about that. Like, I'm content whether life is joyous and sparkly or whether it's melancholic and moody. Like, but can I work toward a position of contentment with all that is?
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, and so that's like kind of like one of the high goals of yogic progression or development is to reach a place of santosha, of this abiding contentment. And like, I don't know, that seems realistic to me actually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
You know? Um, there is, like today is Monday. We're speaking on Monday, and for me, like, it really feels like a moon day. I found it really hard to get out of bed this morning. I think I had really involved dreams, but I didn't bring anything back, but I just had the kind of the leftover resonance of the deep dreams. Um, and I was lying there in bed and I just did not want to get out. And I had to like really like I'm like why bother? Like, I have the day off. I know I'm gonna speak to Ken later, but that's not until later. And like, why get up? And then my dog came over and like started licking my face. I said, okay, we'll start with that. And I don't know. There's something. I was just kind of reflecting on that. Like, what gets us out of bed in the morning when the world can seem so crazy and it's so difficult to live in, like, late stage capitalism, and there's so much demand on us to, like, pay the rent and buy the expensive groceries and gas and all of that. Like, life
Yep.
is, like,
Yeah.
really hard right now.
Yeah.
That I can really, like, sympathize with the people who just don't get out of bed.
Oh, yes. Yep. Yep.
Yeah. So, like, okay, so you have mornings like this. What helps you get out of bed on days like that? Or is the thing to go with soul and like stay in bed? I don't know.
But your dog has a soul too, and I have dogs.
Yeah.
And I have to be really careful because they sleep with me in the bed. And if I if I wake up, if I don't move, we're okay. But if I shift,
Yeah, I know.
then they know.
They're activated. I
And
know.
then it's like, yeah, okay. But um, I think on those days, and there's some days when you just get up and you're ready, and
Yeah.
out, and there's other days where I'm glad my kitchen stays in the same place because I can just get there, and then nobody moves the coffee machine, so I could just make a cup of coffee. And I've gotten to a point where sometimes I'll go in and go, oh, this is okay. And I'll even talk to myself about, like today, I was really slow. And I was thinking, it's okay to be slow. Then there's another part of me that goes, no, it's not okay to be slow. You want to do some things. And to just be present to it, not identify with it, but feel its texture.
Mm,
Like for me, sensing it, looking at all of Jung's functions, what is it like to feel this way? Physically, there was nothing that was hurting. I didn't feel
mhm.
sick. It was just one of those days. And then just being present to it, noticing all of that. Um, it requires, for me, relying on functions that are not my go-to, like sensation.
Mm,
I'm really intuitive. And sometimes it's really good to feel what it feels like to stir the sugar in my coffee, or just watch the sun come up,
mm,
or listen as the pot is boiling with cereal or whatever.
mm.
And then there's other days where I'm just ready to go.
Yeah.
And that's all, I don't know, it's just sort of being gentle with yourself.
Mhm.
And if there's days when you don't want to get up, don't get up, and then see what happens.
Yeah. I keep telling my wife, like, one of these days I'm just gonna stay in bed all day. It's never happened.
Yep. Right, right.
Something stirs me at some point. But like with my dog, so one of the ways I think of soul work too, it's not only like the work I do to stay connected to my soul and to try to like live to cultivate a soulful life and all of that. But it's also like part of like my kind of personal sense of purpose, which is to serve soul, because one of my kind of great grievances with the modern world is like a lack of soul, and how it culture creates people who are lacking in soul, who are only interested in like very superficial things that I really don't care too much about. And so like one of my big laments in life is the lack of soul. And so well, if I flip that and I go, okay, well, you really are missing that or longing for that. It's kind of like a negative calling in a way, like you're being called to the void to do something about it. And so like I'll flip the soul work. It's like, well, I'm working for soul. I'm in service to soul because that's what I want more of in life. And that's what gives me life, literally and metaphorically. Um, and so there's something about that too, like being of service maybe is the first thing that gets me out of bed. And like, thank God for my little dog who's just like ready to go.
Right, right,
Saying
right.
like, let's get out there. I know it's a little rainy and cloudy, but like it'll be beautiful on the
Sure.
trail,
Yeah,
you know?
right, right. And I think that idea of being of service is important. And it's a good counterbalance to, I think we live in a time when persona becomes increasingly more important. And, everything is a soundbite or a picture on a social media or whatever. And I feel sorry for people who are being raised in a world where that seems to be a primary way of connecting to
Mhm.
others. That certainly wasn't true for me. And yet we struggled with persona. We also struggled with persona in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. God knows. But it feels more acute now. It feels
Yeah.
more. Um, I sometimes when I go out to dinner with friends, I'll notice couples, young couples. You can always tell when it's a first date or early in a relationship, and they're taking picture of food.
Mhm.
And I want to say, get rid of the phones. You're sitting in front of a real person. Get to know them. I don't say this because they'll drag me away as a crazy man, but somehow that's everything has to be captured. We've got a mechanism to capture it. It's called our memory. That's what it's for.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I don't know, it just feels there's a time for that. I take pictures, but
Mhm.
there's also a time to just be present to who you're with. And I hope we don't get to a place where that becomes unimportant.
Yeah. Um, Hillman like resisted defining soul, but he attributed different like qualities or attributes to soul. And one of the things he said was that soul turns events into experiences. And I always come back to that because it's kind of like hard to grasp in a way, but part of me understands it, you know?
Mhm.
What's the difference between an event and an experience?
The
Well,
architect of the
the
ground.
the event is something that takes place. Uh, for it to be an experience, there has to be an experiencer.
Right.
There has to be some being who experiences the event and it impacts them in some way. It touches them in some way. It affects them in some way. And that requires presence, physical, embodied, sensual presence. So like those couples, and I saw this the other day too, and I had this a similar thing. This beautiful young couple walks in. You could tell they hadn't quite merged and become like part of each other yet, right? They still had, but they came into the restaurant. They're waiting for food or something, and they're both from the time they walked in the door, they were both staring at their own phones. And I was like, look at, you're both so gorgeous and beautiful and young and glowing. And the phone is more interesting than this person sitting across from you. And I think they were having an event that could be documented through taking a picture and posting on social media, but they weren't having an experience that would be lasting, that they could, when they're 73, look back and go, oh, she was so beautiful then, or.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I, I like that. And Hillman is really good at leaving things undefined, but then going into these beautiful, glorious ex expositions about them.
Mm.
And all this is sense data. Even to call it an event is like bracketing something, but then we have to interact for it to be an experience. And that's that part that I hope we don't lose because then what happens? Then everything just becomes points on a timeline.
Hmm. Yeah, and on my kind of most pessimistic days, I really feel like that is where culture is kind of pushing us in a way with with the reliance on social media, the timeline,
Mm.
right? Like it's kind of all in the language, the avatars, um, and then the way that all of the big companies are pushing AI on us. So every time I open up one of my pieces of software now, whether it's Zoom or my graphic design software or my music editing software, they're pushing up with these pop-ups. Try our new AI feature. Try this. It'll take care of this for you. And like
Yeah.
in Zoom now, there's something that says AI companion, and I want to get rid of that icon. I don't want the AI companion anywhere on my computer
Right.
because I want a companion with the people that are on the other side of the screen. And I wondered, like, is that kind of like where the culture is pushing us to be soulless vessels for this AI neural link internet entity?
Wow. It's so refreshing to hear you talk like this because I always look for signs of becoming an old curmudgeon. And one is just what you're talking about. I can do you one better. I got something, and I won't name the email carrier, but I got this big thing going. Now there's a new AI feature. We can summarize all of your email. No, I want to read my email. I don't want you to summarize it. What is that? What does that even mean?
Mhm.
That you give
Again,
us rules.
what would be left out,
Well,
right? Coming back to the what's left out, yeah.
if I have a friend that writes an email to me, not even a friend, if I have a client or somebody who's writing to ask if I could see them, I don't want that summarized. I want to feel the words. I want to look at the syntax. I want to know what they're talking about,
Right, and how they talk about what they're
how
talking
they
about.
talk about it.
Yeah,
Why, in what universe would I need to have my emails summarized for me?
yeah,
It's bad enough that it's email. We don't get paper anymore. We don't get um
right. Well, how we express ourselves through the email is a reflection or an expression of our soul,
should be.
right?
Yeah.
That individual entity who's had experiences and been shaped by them. It all comes through in the way that I speak to you and speak
That's
about things. Yeah, so that erasure is so frightening to me.
yeah.
And when I see people embrace it because it's novel, it's kind of wow, that's fun, but also it's convenient. Like to have Gmail finish my sentences for me. I mean, there is this rebellious part of me that just refuses that. And like,
I'll
oh,
write
I
it.
may have said that actually, and so pretty good AI, but I'm gonna say it differently just
Yeah,
because,
perfect.
and that's coming from my soul, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I had one of my oldest friends has he's in comparative literature. He's retired now, but he was a comp lit professor. And when I got AI, I got Chat GPT, I think. I thought I'm going to tell it that I want to write an email to this friend, and then I'll send it. So I did.
What
Just
to
an
see if
email.
you could tell it wasn't really
I
you or
wasn't, maybe that was.
Hmm.
He got back to me and he said, "Who wrote that?" And I lied and I said, "Me." He goes, "Uh-uh." Now, this is a guy who can read literature in about 7 languages. He said, "That's not you.
Hmm.
That isn't you at all." And that was an important lesson. I mean, we joke like this back and forth because I was left out. I was not there. And someone who's known me for 60 years can tell.
Hmm.
And that's valuable because what that said to me was there's some ineluctable element
Yeah.
that can't be reproduced. And I don't want to lose that.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. Like, what was the giveaway? Because probably on the surface, probably didn't look a lot different than maybe an email you would have written, but there's lacking some kind of essence or the scent of Ken or, the fingerprint.
Yeah, I don't know. But, as I said, we've known each other since we were about 10. So
Mhm.
much know each other. But it's
And
just,
yeah, and so then like the way I think, what part of him was able to sense that,
mhm,
right? And that's why it's another one of those ways. Okay, well, that I would attribute that to the soul of the person.
I
Like it's
agree.
able to pick up on this kind of sublinguistic, subrational sense of someone. Picking up on like what the kids say, the vibes. You know.
The vibes, yeah, right. Are the kids still saying that?
Well, yeah, they are, because like with Kamala Harris, it's all vibes, no policy, and a lot of people think that's okay. We're voting on a vibe, which scares the hell out of me.
Everything, yeah. Well, and I, yeah. Mm,
Let's
yeah,
not get into politics. I mean,
right.
it's this has been such a great conversation and so like I don't know, meandering, and it's so that to me is like, well, it's a soulful conversation that's going to be hard to summarize.
It will. But you could submit the transcript to AI and see if they can come up with five main points. And if they do, call me because I don't, I was here for the whole thing and I wouldn't know what they are.
Yeah, well, I really appreciate you showing up for this kind of conversation. It's important to me, and part of it is like I think like important for people to hear us, a 50-year-old and a soon to be 73-year-old. You've been in the game a lot longer than I have, and I sense so much kind of still like openness and curiosity and unknowingness about you, and you
Oh,
seem quite content actually to be that way, and I appreciate that. When I first started this almost 6 years ago, very quickly I confronted or encountered what I called expert exhaustion. I got really tired of people who would just show up and kind of give me the lecture, the kind of the canned monologue about their work, and it put me to sleep, and it was just like, and they had answers for everything. If I asked them like what soul was, they would say, "Oh, this is what it is," and like, it's like,
oh,
oh, it's not what I want. I had to discover that for myself too, the kind of conversations I wanted to have and what I valued. So I do really appreciate meeting you and having you show up and
oh,
engage
thank
in
you.
this with me.
I appreciate being asked. Definitely.
Yeah. Great. Well, let me leave it with this. The tarot card that I pulled when we first started talking is, I use the Marseille and I only use the Major Arcana because I think, particularly in this deck, they're the ones with the meaning. Other decks, it's been filled out and all that. But he's number one, Le Battleur, the Magician. And I don't know. What comes to your mind when you see this card in context of our conversation?
Well, the magician is, that's an interesting card because, of course, the kind of underlying sense of the magician is as above, so below. We're going to make it up as we go along. And on the table in front of him, he has emblems of all of the elements,
Hmm.
uh, fire, earth, air, and water, which have to be combined to create anything. It goes back to what I was talking about earlier about the five aggregates in Buddhism. Only in medieval alchemy, it was four elements.
Hmm.
Um,
Well,
there's
plus
also
the quintessence,
plus
sometimes
the
called. Yeah.
quintessence, right? And I think there's an element of play
Hmm.
that, and this is very interesting that you picked that because the book that I was reading just before we got on that I'm going to be using for a course I'm teaching in our analyst training program is an old book by Huizinga called Homo Ludens, which means man, the player, the one who plays.
Huh.
And he talks about how we can analyze play, but the reality of play, he says, extends beyond the sphere of human life. Since it does, it cannot have its foundation in any rational nexus because this would limit it. And the essence of Le Battleur is the play element. How can I play? I think it's what empowered and impelled the alchemists to do
Hmm.
what they did, is to play around. So that's,
Hmm.
I don't even know why I started reading it. I got on a couple of minutes early and I thought, well, I'll just do that. So we were kind of in sync with that.
Hmm.
It's the beginning of the whole thing. because it's number one in the majors.
Yeah, and I think too, like this is an archaic French term, bateleur, but I believe when I looked it up years ago that it actually closest translation might be juggler or something,
Uh-huh. Yes.
right? So
Right.
there's that aspect of play there. And how nice that we're ending our conversation with the word play when we started with like, talking about soul work. And like soul work as play is kind of an interesting way to leave it.
It is. That's beautiful.
Yeah, cool. All right, Ken, thanks again.
Thank you very much. Take
Take
care.